This is today's Battlegrounds. Our discussions with leaders from around the world consider how history produced the present and how we can work together to overcome obstacles to progress, seize opportunities, and build a better tomorrow.
On this episode of today's Battlegrounds, our discussion spans the Republic of Peru, Latin America, and a new book on Sir Francis Bacon, Nature and the Human Condition. Our guest is Dr. Francisco Sagasti, President of Peru from November 2020 to July 2021. Sagasti previously served in the Peruvian Congress, where he headed his party's parliamentary caucus and chaired the Science, Technology, and Innovation Committee. He has been head of strategic planning at the World Bank and president of the United Nations Council on Science and Technology. Sagasti taught at the Wharton School, IE Business School, and the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Sagasti is currently a professor at Pacifico Business School in Lima. He is the founder of the Peruvian think tank, GRADE. He is a prolific scholar who has authored over 25 books and hundreds of academic papers. Sagasti holds engineering degrees from the National Engineering University in Peru and Penn State University, as well as a PhD in Operations Research and Social System Sciences from the University of Pennsylvania. Peru is a country with a rich history and diverse population. By the 15th century, Peru's Inca Empire had become the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere, integrating vast Andean territories through sophisticated agriculture, engineering, and administrative systems. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors executed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, seized the capital of Cusco, and established colonial rule. Peru declared independence from Spain in 1821, and Simon Bolivar's military campaign ended Spanish rule in 1824. Peru struggled to maintain territorial integrity over the following decades. It fought with Bolivia against Chile in the War of the Pacific over the resource-rich Atacama Desert from 1879 to 1884. In the 20th century, through the World Wars and early Cold War, the various civilian governments and military regimes that ruled Peru generally pursued economic cooperation and security ties with the United States. During the military dictatorship of Juan Velasco Alvarado from 1968 to 1975, Lima established close ties with Moscow and Havana, leaning on the USSR for weapons. General Francisco Morales Bermudez, who deposed Alvarado, was preoccupied fighting the Sendero Luminoso Maoist insurgency and proved unable to enact political or economic reforms. A democratically elected government in 1980 ended Peru's security relationship with the Soviets and realigned with the United States. Since the end of the Cold War, the Peruvian-U.S. relationship has shifted based on the priorities and political leadership of both nations. The 2009 U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement reduced tariffs and expanded market access for goods, services, and investments. Over the next decade, bilateral trade grew steadily. The United States became one of Peru's top export destinations for minerals, agricultural products, and textiles. In April 2025, new tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on select Peruvian commodities prompted renewed negotiations about the nature of the U.S.-Peru trade relationship. And though the Peruvian Congress voted to expand its military cooperation with the United States in early 2025, Peru has also welcomed Chinese investment, including the $3.5 billion Chancay Megaport project designed for military as well as commercial use. Sagasti came to the Peruvian presidency in a time of turbulence and uncertainty during the COVID-19 pandemic. Peruvian President Martín Vizcarra had been impeached for moral incapacity, a vague Peruvian legal term, in November 2020. Many Peruvians equated the impeachment to a coup. Opposition leader Manuel Merino assumed the presidency legally, but violently suppressed protests forced Merino to resign 5 days later. Sagasti's fellow congressmen voted him to become president of the Congress so he could have the legal right to succession. Sagasti became acting president on November 17, 2020. He restored stability to Peru, rebuilt public trust in the government, secured much-needed COVID-19 vaccines, and ensured a peaceful transfer of power in the 2021 presidential election. President Pedro Castillo succeeded Sagasti in July 2021, then in December 2022 faced impeachment for an attempted illegal self-coup in which he tried to dissolve Congress and install an emergency government. Violent nationwide protests followed. The presidency of Castillo's Vice President Dina Boluarte was turbulent. We speak with President Sagasti days after the Peruvian Congress impeached Boluarte and installed José Herrí as president. We welcome President Sagasti to discuss lessons from his leadership of Peru, regional challenges to freedom and prosperity in Latin America, and his latest book, which explores the life and relevance of Sir Francis Bacon's philosophy for today's international system.
President Francisco Sagasti, welcome to Battlegrounds. Bienvenido. It's an honor to host you.
Thank you very much, General McMaster. You know, I've been in several battlegrounds, but not one like this one, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, you've been in political battlegrounds and what might even be worse, academic battlegrounds. So you're the perfect person to talk to. And the first question I'd like to ask you about is your leadership. You know, you stepped up to the presidency at probably, I would say, the most challenging time you could imagine. People are losing faith in the government. It was happening during the COVID epidemic, which hit Peru very, very hard. And so could you talk about why you chose to lead and serve at that time, and maybe some reflections on your presidency and what you were able to achieve?
Well, you know, I didn't choose to run or anything like that. You know, it so happened. I told, when there were all the conversations about who was going to succeed President Merino after 5 days, he resigned after 5 days in office after protest, and he was put there because the previous president had been vacated from office, impeached. So I didn't look for it, but at the same time, I told those who were assembling in Congress that I'm not going to campaign, I'm not going to go there and ask for votes, but if elected, I will hold office, and this is what I did. I consider this an honor, an obligation, and I think looking backwards, by some fluke, I was more or less prepared to do it at a very difficult time, as you suggested. So it wasn't my choice, but it was my duty. I accepted it. And frankly, one of the things that some political commentators have said is that I'm probably the only president elected by his political enemies. They expected me to fail very quickly because there was such a huge, tremendous crisis. And they saw me as a kind of mild-mannered intellectual who probably didn't know a little enough about all the complicated aspects of politics. And in the end, I ended up being the president that had the highest approval rate at the end of his term in the last 20 years. So I guess I disappointed them.
Well, you went from 30% to 60% approval rate during COVID. I mean, the exact opposite effect. What do you attribute that to? I have a theory. My theory is that you applied to leadership of the presidency what you applied to your scholarship, because I've been reading your superb books, and you take an interdisciplinary approach to try to understand complex challenges and opportunities. And is that what you did as presidency? Could you, as president, could you talk about your presidency, how you organized it, and how you achieved what you did achieve?
Well, the first thing is to realize that you cannot do things alone, that we are in a very complicated world that changes very quickly. So the first thing you need to do is to choose a highly competent, loyal, knowledgeable team that is committed to the common good. And I was lucky enough that my contacts over the last 40, 50 years provided me with a broad range of people that I knew would serve in. So the most important thing was to assemble a team that could work together. Previous governments and governments in other parts of the world usually have fights in between ministers, within agencies, between the judiciary and Congress, between Congress and the executive and the comptroller's office and so on. My main objective is that the heck with it. We are in crisis. We are all going to work together. My predecessors had big fights with the private sector, with civil societies. They were disqualifying each other and saying, I put a stop to all of that. We will all come together, we'll sit at the same table, and we'll work together. And, we did. So I guess that was one of the main reasons why I was able to do what I did.
I think we need that leadership more than ever today, Mr. President. We see a lot of our polities fragmenting, and we see the extreme parties coming into power. You've written about how this is the case in Peru, because the first two parties that get past the post essentially come into the government, and a minority of Peruvians have voted for them. I have a soft spot in my heart for Peru. I love Peru because 43 years ago, I was an exchange cadet at the Academia Militar de Chorrillos, and I try to follow Peru closely, and I've been aware of these cycles that happen in Peru politically. But could you maybe explain to our listeners what just happened in Peru in context of this recent political history? And of course, I'm talking about the recent ouster of Dina Boluarte, and the erosion of sort of the democratic norms that has been part of her story, as well as maybe some of this recent violence and how that precipitated her departure out of government. Just could you explain politics in Peru today in context of recent years?
Well, it is quite difficult to explain because it has been a steady deterioration in the quality of politics, and more important, in the quality of politicians. Politics is considered so dirty, so ungrateful, that no one with with preparation, commitment, and so on wants to get involved because they feel that they are going to be dragged through the mud. They are going to be impeached. I had to deal with something like 16 or 17 constitutional accusations, which one by one have been sort of rejected, but still there is one going on that I have to deal with. So good people do not want to get into politics, and this is really a disaster, because then, as Plato said, the price of not getting involved in politics is to be governed by the worst. And this is what is gradually been happening in Peru. In terms of the political structure, General McMaster, what you have is a paradoxical situation, what I've been calling an authoritarian anarchy. Yeah. If the two things are quite opposite, but it's not the case. You have a fragmentation in Congress, a political fragmentation. We have now 44 or 45 political parties that are qualified to participate in the elections of next year. So basically, there are a lot of minute interests which get together every so often for particular purposes, and it's a purely transactional thing. Well, I'll give you the Supreme Court and I vote for your candidate if you give me the ombudsman's office. I'll give you 3 judges and you give me 4 ministers and so on. So there is no direction, there is no policy. It is basically a pure short-term transactional political process with very individual, selfish objectives in mind. And that is what we need to change. And frankly, it's not very easy.
The interim president, Jose Jerry, has said that he wants to start a war on crime. I think he's impelled to do that by the shooting at the concert that really led to the wounding of some of the band members and then precipitated the president's ouster. But what advice would you give him as he comes into office? What should he take on, and what are the people demanding from the government? What is the source of popular discontent these days in Peru?
Well, it's not discontent; it's disgust. Let's put it this way: with the whole political establishment. President Boluarte, when she was impeached, had 3% approval rate, which is within the margin of error. So it could
Wow.
be zero
Yeah.
or -3 if you wish. Congress has about 4 to 5% approval rate. So there is a massive rejection of politics as it is being practiced now. uh, what to do with it, how to come out of that situation. Why is it that we got into this? I explained basically because we have left politics in the hands of very, very greedy, individualistic people. And in addition to that, organized crime and disorganized crime as well are penetrating all levels of politics, from district government all the way to parliament and even to the government itself. So therefore, we have a very complicated fight against organized crime and, which is even more complicated, disorganized crime, those spontaneous people who just simply either resort to extortion or to theft or to, a variety of other things. Uh, I try to deal with that, but it's not easy because you have, unfortunately, a few members of the police force involved in these activities as well. So therefore, you need to have a cleanup of the police force, and that takes, the way we looked at it, you can hold things as they are now and prevent from them getting worse within the police. But to really modify it, it takes about a full term, 5 years at least, and you require a lot of concerted actions everywhere, everything from training of policemen. We have 14 police schools, and out of those, there are at least two or three which basically, rather than training police, are training delinquents in uniform. So therefore, you need to close a few, you need to change that, but that takes time and requires a lot of political determinations. And frankly, I do not know whether the current president has the background, the knowledge, the commitment, and the support to do what is required to do in the next 9 months. So therefore, we'll have to see what this roulette of 32 or 33 candidates is going to produce in elections in April in the first round, and then a month later the second round, to figure out whether we'll have more of the same as of 2026, which then will take us to 2031, or we'll have a hope for change.
Okay, that's we're talking about the next general election, April of 2026, and then the election after that. So you're seeing more hopeful on the long-term prospects. Mr. President, I'm thinking about the story of Colombia and how Colombia was was a disaster in the late 1990s, and then fought back under Uribe's leadership, to regain control and to get on a successful path. It's gone through another cycle now with Petro, this far left government. But Peru itself has been through very difficult times. And when I arrived in Peru in 1982, Sendero Luminoso, the Maoist kind of far left terrorist organization, was very strong, and the government had just changed dramatically from almost a client state of the Soviets to more of a Western-leaning government. So Peru has reinvented itself in the past. Do you feel optimistic when you look longer term?
I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. I tend to be a realistic. I believe that you need to start from where you are and then figure out how you can do better. And I know we can. Well, as you point out, we have done it in the past, and we have gone from, if you want to take a long historical perspective, from being a backwater and client state, first of the UK, the United Kingdom, then of the US, then of the Soviet Union, and then finally we found more or less our own way, our own path. And now we have a very strong Chinese investment in there, and as you know very well how they behave. So the task is an extremely complicated one in this new geopolitical setting, which I tend to describe in my latest book, which requires a very sophisticated way of looking at your own strengths internally, looking at the way the world is evolving, and then finding how the cracks through which you can start to move to regain and maintain a bit of independence in terms of policy, to work with everybody and try to improve the lot of the population, trying to improve the quality of life. It's not a dream. I know it is possible. I remember an interview I had a couple of years ago when the interviewer told me Peru cannot be governed, it's a disaster, it cannot be governed in democracy. And I said, yes, it can. Oh, no, no, no. And then insisted. At the third time, I lost my patience. Say, yes, it can. I did it. Okay? So therefore, that ended the discussion. What I'm trying to point out is that it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. It's a question of assembling the right group of people. And I'm old enough to have seen people who appear to be extremely, what you could say, mistaken, extremist, unpopular, change their views. And even if you don't agree with them, even if you condemn them, they do some good things. So therefore, you have to keep an open mind. Talk to everybody, even who appears to be your worst enemy, in order to be able to find a way. When I was in the presidency, I invited all the political parties, even those that opposed me, that submitted impeachment motions in there, and sat them around the table, listened to them, talked to them. We had a very cordial exchange. The moment they left my office, the moment they left the lunch table, they went out and gave an incendiary press conference against me. But that's part of the game. You have to get accustomed to that and keep on chugging along without paying attention to these distractions, which take you away or take you off your track of trying to improve and to do the things right. And it can be done.
Well, I think you're showing us kind of the power of philosophy and your knowledge of philosophy. When I hear you talk, when I read your fantastic book, Knowledge is Power, and your book, 5 essays, Uncertainty, 5 essays to understand our times, I see that you do focus, focus on what we can control, kind of the Aristotle's approach to things, and you can get a lot done. So I want to talk more about regional dynamics, but let's talk about your books now and about your philosophy of leadership. Because I think when I read your books, you bridge between disciplines and you take a deeply kind of humane approach to what's going on in our world, what it means to govern and live. And so our listeners have already heard some of your leadership philosophy, but what I'd like to also hear is why you're still confident in democracy. You talked about the fragmentation of Peruvian politics. It seems so daunting and people are disgusted with the system. But you treat democracy as kind of a living practice, and you focus on leaders really responsibility to serve those who they're representing, and also another big theme for you is dignity. Could you maybe explain why you're still confident in democracy and what are the qualities we have to kind of rekindle in political leaderships, but also what our citizens have to keep in mind in terms of their responsibilities?
Well, these are very, very important questions. And the main thing to remember is what Churchill said many years ago, that democracy is the worst system accepting all others that have been invented. And my argument is that we have to keep on reinventing democracy. And why is that? When you have a turbulent time, when you have a great deal of uncertainty, when things change all the time, what you need is flexibility. What you need is the capacity to adapt. What you need is the capacity to listen to different voices and see how they fit in, how you can learn, how you can weave, if you wish, ways of moving forward when all the polity appears to be totally divided, okay? Now, that is not possible without an autocracy, with autocratic governments. They are vertical. The leader knows what needs to be done. He is the only one. He listens only to the close advisors and nobody else. and therefore loses the capacity for adaptation, loses the capacity for understanding all these changes. Those governments that are open, flexible, that listen to alternative views, and can navigate these complex situations are the ones that are likely to improve the quality of life of their peoples. I do not believe, and I have not seen over the medium and long term, and I have experience in my own country, I haven't seen autocracies really improve. The supposed advantage of autocracies is that, we need to listen, don't listen to anybody, we can act, we can really do things. False. What they do is basically they go a bridge too far, and you are in the military, you know what it is. They don't secure all the ground by agreement, by consensus, by acceptance, by gaining legitimacy in the population. They believe that you can gain legitimacy by being hard, by imposing things, and so on. And in addition to that, all autocratic leaders are subject to what I've been calling the three viruses. The first one is the virus of indispensability. I am the only one who knows. Nobody else knows. I know what needs to be done. So shut up. I know it. The second one is the virus of authoritarianism. Because I know what needs to be done, then I can impose it on others. And those who disagree with me, go to hell if you want to. And the third virus is the virus of corruption. If I am the one who knows, if I have the authority, why wouldn't I benefit for all the good things for the rest of the people? So therefore, those three things in different orders end up undermining autocratic governments. That's the reason, by default, that democracy, with all its defects, with all its problems, is a better way of organizing society to find ways of improving the quality of life of the people.
Gosh, that's a brilliant summary, which we will do our best to amplify, that very clear description. So despite these advantages of democracies, we've seen this, sort of red wave with far left authoritarian governments on the rise. And of course, the example is the Chavista movement, and now Maduro, who seems determined to destroy that country. There are now almost 8 billion Venezuelan refugees in a country that has so much potential, so much wealth. You've seen the return of Ortega to Nicaragua, which I never thought would be possible. And you've seen the Cuban army, remain in power in Cuba. But in particular, could you maybe talk a little bit about what's happening in Venezuela and what you think the dynamics are, especially now with...
You have to consider also Milei and Bukele. Wait
Yeah,
a minute.
okay, that's true.
No,
That's true.
don't
That's true.
focus only on the left authoritarians. We have authoritarians from the right, not only in Latin America, but elsewhere in the world. I am against both forms of authoritarianism.
So just for our listeners, we're talking about Bukele in El Salvador, who took power, rewrote the Constitution, and is remaining in power and is engaged in a massive anti-crime crackdown, which has led to the warehousing of large numbers of young men. And then Milei, who came to power in an election, though, I would say, Mr. President, and elections still matter there, having just lost some of the local elections, even though he has taken out his chainsaw, might be out of gas, maybe in Argentina.
Well, let's put it this way. I guess that I want to prove the point that it doesn't matter the ideological or political orientation of autocratic governments. In the end, they end up with the same method: subverting elections, making indefinite re-election possible, remaining in power, really controlling the judiciary, Congress, and everything. It doesn't matter where they are, from the right or from the left.
Right.
The main
No, I
thing
do
is
think actually these ideologies, they do come full circle at some point. They
this
do
is the problem.
come full circle.
That's the reason why I'm so strongly in favor of, with all its faults, of democratic governance. And not only that, but I know it's possible, and I know you can do it. And you have seen many countries that have tried that. Now, here in Latin America, we have really the combination of experiment and it's quite likely that in the next elections, you will see probably in Chile, probably in Colombia, probably in Peru, right-wing governments elected. It's a very distinct possibility. So therefore, what you point out are kind of as a left wing oriented set of governments may suddenly change. But frankly, I do not think that if they do not adopt broad democratic practices, the result will be the same regardless of their political orientation. In the case of El San Salvador, 80,000 young people put in jail with absolutely no rights. Estimates by human rights organizations indicate that at least 60 or 70% of those in jail are innocent people and are treated in inhuman conditions. In Venezuela, as you pointed out, we have the worst economic situation in a very rich country. In Nicaragua, this is a total disaster. It's a kind of a family rule. And, we are going with Ortega's exactly to where we were with the Somozas. This is just crazy.
No,
The
no,
orientation.
it's a great way to put it. And
Yeah.
and of course, you're talking about the far right military dictatorship of Somoza, and how Ortega was part of the Sandinista movement to overthrow it, but now he's as worse
And now
as the
it's doing
dictator,
exactly
as
the
the
same as
dictator
they-
the dictator he opposed. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
No, that's the reason why I do believe. And I think that Milei is also in a very complicated and difficult position. They have been elected by their own governments. In the case of Ortega and in the case of Maduro, it is clear that they have really subverted the electoral processes and have zero democratic legitimacy, whereas in other cases they still have the trappings of democratic legitimacy, but they are rapidly exhausting it, very, very rapidly exhausting it, and one has to be extremely careful of what may come later on. So my main point is re-emphasize the importance of democracy and democratic practices, of renewing what it means, and I just hint at some possible ways of modifying the ways in which democratic governance is organized nowadays. But this requires a lot of thinking, a lot of negotiations, and so on, and it will take some time for any of those ideas, if ever, to be adopted.
A lot of these dictatorships get considerable external support. I'm thinking in Venezuela's case in particular, you have Russia and Cuba providing a lot of security assistance. You have China with economic assistance. Even the Iranians are in the game and propping up Maduro.
And
It was
we
great.
don't forget the assistance that the US gave to Pinochet. We don't forget the assistance that the US gave in order to overthrow Arbenz. So let's be clear. We have to condemn both sides and both sets of intervention. I am in favor of autonomy, and I am in favor of maintaining our independence and our capacity for autonomous decision making. But we have been subjected for too long for a tradition. And I would suggest, I'm sure you have read the 1976 church report of intervention of the US in Chile. I read it and I wrote about it. And you can see very clear what the US did at that time in Chile is what the Russians did in Venezuela, what the Russians did in Cuba, and so on. So let's move into a situation in which we do not depend in Russia, the US, China, whatever power, and we try to develop our own independent ways of organizing of democratic governance.
Yeah, I think a way to think about it, right, is to sidestep or to get around this problem of intervention in others' affairs, is to think of it more in terms of how to support those who are advocating for their own freedom and their own liberty. And so I was heartened to see Maria Machado, for example, receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What do you think is appropriate, right? And you're making the case about the long and a very sad history of U.S. interventions in Latin America. What can be done from the outside to support groups like the Venezuelan opposition?
I think that there are several things that can be done. In the first case, which is something that is not in vogue at present, is to involve multilateral institutions, international organizations, both intergovernmental and non-governmental. That's the main thing. When one power or another power intervenes single-handedly without international support, then all kinds of mishaps, all kinds of distortions can happen. I think that the best way of supporting this is through multilateral efforts. Second, I think that the support of oppositions, democratic oppositions to authoritarian governments, it's also a priority for private foundations, NGOs. When I see how people demonize the open society, I get I begin to laugh, frankly, because it's either of ignorance or malevolence, and either of them is no excuse for that. We have seen what they have done over time in terms of supporting. And this question of polarizing and demonizing things usually happens when you have one country and one government. It is much more difficult to do that when you have a multilateral system in a multilateral organizations that can jointly support. So that is the reason why I do believe that the best way of supporting the Corina Machados and so on is, for example, what we are trying to do in the Club de Madrid of former presidents and prime ministers, what many other international organizations are trying to do in order to fight organized crime all over the world, like the Global Initiative, which is based in Vienna. I think that there are many international and multilateral efforts that have a better chance of avoiding the temptation of imposing one perspective when you're dealing with a single power who begins to support the democratic, if you wish, conversion or democratic processes in any country that is subjected to either right-wing or left-wing autocratic governments.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, of course, it's a competition because so many of these international organizations they're contested spaces themselves. There are competitions going on inside, for example, the Organization of American States, where Venezuela has been very good at cultivating some good relationships with countries who block any action to restore the constitution in Venezuela, for example. But it's a point well taken. I tried very hard with the OAS years ago, and it was just very difficult.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And one of my main points, that you have seen it in what I've written, we need a new generation of international institutions and organizations. The ones that we have at present, like the Organization of American States, and even the United Nations in some of its aspects, and many other international organizations are the product of the post-World War II period, of a period of the Cold War, of the period of the US hegemony, and this is over. So we now have a much more complex world that requires a different type of international organizations and institutions. Moreover, we have also the participation and extreme power, as I point out of my book, of the techno-oligarchs, as they call it, which can basically, because of the tremendous power of technological, of platforms, of artificial intelligence, and so on, virtually impose their views on states. So how do we deal with that new source of power that is even greater than the power that at the end of the 19th century, the oligarchs in the US had, when you had the oil barons, the steel barons, and so on? The power that these techno-feudals, as they call, have at present is much greater than it was at that time. How to bring them in, how to rein their appetites, how to create some order, not only between states, but also with these other participants, which are really playing a major role in politics at the world level. So it's a new challenge, General McMaster. It's a new way that we need to rethink what international organizations. And you are right that the OAS is being blocked by a coalition of Venezuelan and Caribbean countries that depend on Venezuelan and sort of Russian largesse. So therefore, how long can that last for? Obviously it's becoming ineffective. So these institutions are going to gradually fade into the sunset and become, and we are not thinking of anything to replace them. So we need an exercise of imagination tempered by discipline, figuring out in this fractured global order that we have at present, what are the possible institutional arrangements to promote democracy, to protect the environment. And this is a key issue because one of the things we are doing is basically destroying the ecosystems that support human life. And this is on a route, on a direction that we have seen hasn't stopped. We don't have as yet the type of institutional and organizational arrangements that brings everybody to the table, the private sector, the public sector, academia, organizations, the NGOs, non-governmental institutions, the churches, and so on, and figure out how is it that we're going to deal with the challenges that we have over the next 3 or 4 decades. I have some ideas, but this would take too long to explain.
Well, we just have time for a couple more questions, and I really appreciate your time here. But I think there is a new form of geopolitical competition emerging. You mentioned kind of the era of gunboat diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere, and I think of really two battlegrounds, that are prominent in the geostrategic rivalry between what I would describe as two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass, China and Russia, and especially China. And those battlegrounds to me seem to be cognitive, which you've already alluded to, the ability for the policing of thoughts, the manipulation of perception with various algorithms connected to social media, and then the other is economic, where we have seen how China in particular has been quite successful at subverting sovereignty with these predatory loans and investments. Ecuador and the dam is a good example, I think. And now, of course, you're coping with the massive port project and this intensifying. Peru's right in the middle of the big geostrategic competition over minerals and rare earths and mining and refinement and mineral separation. So how do you think about Peru's place in this competition now? What are your concerns about sovereignty, maybe even sovereignty of people's minds, in connection with the cognitive warfare and sovereignty from an economic perspective?
Well, let's turn to the first one, sovereignty from, of minds, if you wish, of concepts, of views, of ways of viewing the world. I think, to be perfectly clear, as someone used to say many years ago in the US, let me make myself perfectly clear. You remember that politician in the US. What I would argue is that the actual generation, those who are over 40 and so on, I wouldn't say they are lost, but they are very difficult to recover in the sense that they have been reared, they have been accustomed to a much more benign information environment, and therefore are less prepared to really look into the potentials for all this misinformation, fake news, and all the rest that we are seeing now, to less able to distinguish and work with them. In the younger generations, I have some hope because one of the trends that I have seen now is that many young people are abandoning their over-reliance on social media. I mean, some of the recent trends that you see in there point in a slightly different direction. So my main argument in terms of a battle of the minds, if you will, a battlegrounds of the mind, is to focus on that generation, or the next generation of political leaders, those who are under 40, who really have a different perspective and who can really adapt much faster. What you need to do is basically to learn and use the same methods that we know that the Russians have been using for a long, long time, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, we know what needs to be done, and I guess that the Ukrainians have found ways of counteracting this in a very effective way. So we need to learn from that, how to win the battles of the mind, and I would focus on the next generation. Then there are two other battlegrounds, not just one. On the economic one, I think that we need, frankly, to figure out our own ways of defending ourselves. It's not very easy, frankly. The pressures that you get from one side or the other, and I have seen the pressures coming from different sides in my own country over the last 60 years and so on, or even longer. I'm 81 years old, so I began to be active in politics when I was 16, 17, as a student leader at the university. So I have seen these things in a long, long time. The question is how to defend ourselves from these pushes and so on. And this requires, first of all, a firm conviction of what you just said, of our own resources, of our own potential, of all the things that we have. And this is not happening. So one of the things I'm telling in every lecture that I give, every conference to young people, is look at this diversity of diversity in terms of resources, people, richness that we have, and see how to use that, and not surrender that to one or to another group, but to use that in our own benefits, and to the extent possible play one against the other, which can be done. And as you as a strategist know very well how this is done in the battlefield or in practice. I do believe now. The problem is a little bit more complicated. We started discussing politics in Peru, and I mentioned the penetration of delinquency, crime, graft, bribes, and so on at the political level. And this is being used by corporations, this is being used by governments as well. So therefore, they can go from a very simple thing. Oh, if you vote for this, if you approve that, then hey, your daughter can have a fellowship there, or you can visit this, and so on and so forth. That's the mildest form to all other forms in which you know that money exchanges hands. It's difficult to prove, but we know it happens. So you have a very difficult task in reasserting our own autonomy, our own sovereignty, unless we get a new generation of politicians that are conscious, A, of the things that need to be done, B, of our potential, and C, of the ways in which you can reinsert ourselves as a Peruvians in the modern world while maintaining our autonomy. And there are several instances in which we have lost it, either to private corporations, to one power, or to another, mainly because either carelessness, or ignorance, or simply chicanery or corruption. So we need to change that. So it's no way we can find a better way of fitting into the emerging international geopolitical order unless we first put our own house in order. That is very clear to me.
Well, President Sagasti, that's such a powerful message. I would just want to ask you one last question, really for that younger generation of viewers. Two of the words that strike me in your work and your two most recent books is empathy, which is really the organizing principle of this program, of this series, to understand complex challenges and opportunities from the perspective of others. You've helped us do that tremendously. But what you counsel is listening deeply, working in teams. And then I like this phrase of holding space for paradoxes and plurality, right? And not to go into your little corners and to be open to others. And then trust. Trust is a word that a guy named General Martin Dempsey, one of my old mentors and a fantastic leader, used to emphasize all the time, because he said trust is the foundation of combat effectiveness for military units, right? And you talk about how trust, excuse me, gives you a feeling of security, an attitude toward openness, and then allows you to build relationships through common action. I think we need both of those today. Could you comment on that maybe, and maybe just couch that in terms of advice for younger generations?
Well, I think that, I will go beyond that. It's not just trust that is necessary for combat effectiveness. Trust is necessary for everything that we do in our life. I mean, this trust is what binds a society together. If we cannot trust others and those who we don't know, simply you cannot do anything collectively. And there is no way that a single individual can survive without collective action, without working with others. Now, it is not easy to build and to recover confidence and trust. And I think that the first thing, and this is what I try to explain in my book, is that you start generating trust by giving trust. If I trust you, Mr. McMaster, I say, I trust you. I generate a sense of obligation. If you are a person of values and so on, you feel that you have to live up to the trust that other person places on you. And, you begin to play in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that you give a blank check to everybody. You cannot be so innocent. You cannot trust the untrustworthy. So therefore, I trust others.
Vladimir Putin is popping into my mind for some reason.
You can give trust, and so on. But the moment they betray it, oh, come on, stop. You stop giving it. And I think I mentioned the story in the book, which when I was, a teenager, I was bothered by the precept in St. Lucas Gospel that if they hit you in one cheek, you have to put the other. And I said, hell with it. Does it mean that we need to be like, doormats and everybody and so on? So I went to see a young priest who was a friend of mine and said, look, explain that. I said, read it again. And I said, well, if you slap you on the face, you should turn the other cheek. I said, you see what I mean? No. It doesn't say the next thing. If they slap you a second time, there is nothing written. Hit them with everything you have. What I'm trying to point out is to generate trust, you give trust, but you are not really naive or very innocent and so on. And you gradually begin to create these bonds. But in order to generate trust in others, you first have to trust yourself. And this is really one of the main problems, General McMaster. The insecurity of many leaders, the lack of confidence and trust in themselves, that the only way they can feel safe, secure, and in command is by imposing their views in others. They feel threatened by other views because they are so weak inside that there is no way they can withstand a different opinion from that they hold. So the first thing I tell in my lectures to all young people, build trust in yourself, build confidence in yourself, know who you are, know your limitations, accept them, be ready to accept help, be ready to listen to others, and on the basis of that, form a firm view and opinion and maintain it. But don't sort of shelter yourself from the others, open yourself up, and in that way, you can really make a big difference by asserting what you believe and trying to improve the human condition.
President Sagasti, thank you so much. Those are wise words. You're a wise man. Thank you for your leadership, for your scholarship. And on behalf of the Hoover Institution, thank you for helping us learn more about Battlegrounds, important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. What a pleasure. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for you for having me and to all your audience. I think you're doing a great job, and I hope that young people in the US listen to your sessions, your podcasts, your interviews in order to broaden their views.
And I hope in Peru too. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Today's Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.